At my sister's wedding reception, I wore my only clean dress, a faded thrift store find that barely fit, while everyone else sparkled in designer gowns. When the maid of honor asked what I did for work and I said I was between jobs, the entire bridal party erupted in laughter, whispering about the family disappointment. But then Marcus, my sister's Coast Guard friend, walked over, looked me directly in the eyes, and gave me the sharpest military salute I'd ever seen. That's when I realized he was the only person in that room who knew what those scars on my arms really meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At my sister's wedding reception, I wore my only clean dress while everyone else sparkled in designer gowns. When they laughed at me for being between jobs, I thought it was the lowest moment of my life. But then Marcus, a Coast Guard friend of my sister's, saluted me with military precision. That's when I realized he was the only person in that room who understood what my scars really meant. My name is Riley Martinez, and for most of my life, I was the sister nobody talked about. Not because I was the black sheep, because I was invisible. While my sister Caroline collected academic awards, debate team trophies, and eventually a full scholarship to Georgetown Law, I collected secrets I couldn't share with anyone. We grew up in the manicured suburbs of Alexandria, Virginia, where success was measured by your SAT scores and your parents' Mercedes models. Our mother, Dr. Patricia Martinez, was a renowned cardiologist. Our father, Richard, was a federal judge. Caroline fit their world perfectly. Honor roll student, student council president, destined for greatness. I was the daughter who struggled with dyslexia, barely graduated high school, and had no college prospects. At 18, when Caroline was giving graduation speeches about changing the world, I was sitting in a military recruitment office in downtown D.C. The recruiter, Sergeant Thompson, didn't ask about my GPA or my future plans. He asked if I was ready to serve my country. For the first time in my life, someone was offering me a chance to matter. Yurazie, Yasudakeki Astons, I enlisted in the Army as a combat medic without telling my parents. I left a note on my pillow and caught a bus to Fort Benning for basic training. My mother called it a phase. My father called it disappointing. Caroline called it embarrassing. They attended my graduation ceremony but left immediately after, as if my military service was something to be endured rather than celebrated. 3 deployments to Afghanistan changed everything. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was essential. When soldiers were wounded, they called for me. When convoys were attacked, I was the one who kept people alive until we could get them to safety. I saved 17 lives during my service. I lost count of how many I couldn't save. But the war followed me home. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way I jumped every time a car backfired. The VA diagnosed me with PTSD and gave me a handful of pamphlets about readjustment. My family gave me awkward hugs and changed the subject whenever I tried to talk about my experiences. Caroline was building her perfect life. Law degree, prestigious firm, engagement to James Whitfield, whose family owned half the real estate in Northern Virginia. Meanwhile, I was struggling to hold down jobs, fighting panic attacks in grocery stores, and living in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew. The contrast between us had never been starker. When Caroline announced her engagement, she asked me to be a bridesmaid with the same enthusiasm someone might show when asking you to help them move furniture. I was an obligation, not a choice. She wanted the perfect wedding photos, and having her veteran sister standing beside her would look good for her political aspirations. The wedding planning became a 6-month reminder of everything I wasn't. While Caroline's friends discussed their careers as lawyers, doctors, and consultants, I worked part-time at a veterinary clinic and delivered food on weekends. While they shopped at Nordstrom for their bridesmaid dresses, I scraped together money for a second-hand dress from Goodwill. But none of them knew what I'd really been through. None of them understood that the quiet girl in the corner had once performed emergency surgery in the back of a Humvee while under enemy fire. They saw failure where there should have been respect. They saw disappointment where there should have been gratitude. That wedding reception was supposed to be Caroline's perfect moment. Instead, it became the night I finally realized that some people would never see my worth, but others would recognize it immediately. Coming home from deployment should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like stepping into someone else's life. Caroline had transformed our childhood home into a showcase of her accomplishments. Law school diplomas, internship certificates, and engagement photos covered every surface. My military awards were nowhere to be seen. Our parents treated my return like I'd been away at summer camp, rather than serving in a war zone. At the welcome dinner they organized, the conversation revolved around Caroline's upcoming partnership track at Morrison & Associates and her wedding venue selection. When I tried to share stories about the field hospital I'd helped establish in Kandahar, the table went silent. My father cleared his throat and asked Caroline about her honeymoon plans to Italy. Nantul, the Alexandria social circle my family moved in, had very specific ideas about success. It involved degrees from Ivy League schools, six-figure salaries, and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Military service was something blue-collar families did, not people like us. At dinner parties, when other parents bragged about their children's achievements, my mother would mention Caroline's law review publication and quietly skip over me entirely. I tried to fit back into their world. I attended Caroline's charity galas, wearing borrowed dresses and fake smiles. I sat through brunches with her law school friends, listening to them complain about the stress of choosing between job offers at top firms. When they asked what I was doing now that I was back, I learned to say I was exploring my options instead of mentioning my PTSD therapy appointments. The contrast was crushing. While Caroline's Instagram showed perfectly curated photos of her courtroom victories and romantic dinners with James, my days were filled with job applications that went nowhere and sleepless nights replaying firefights. While she planned her dream wedding, I was learning how to grocery shop without having panic attacks when I heard loud noises. Our parents' disappointment was never stated outright, but it lived in every interaction. When Caroline brought James home for Sunday dinners, they asked detailed questions about his work and hung on every word. When I mentioned my job interviews, they offered brief encouragement before changing the subject. When Caroline announced her engagement, they threw a celebration party. When I told them about receiving a commendation for saving 3 soldiers during a mortar attack, they said, quote, "That's nice, honey," and continued discussing wedding venues. The wedding preparations became a 6-month reminder of how different our paths had become. Caroline's bridal party consisted of her sorority sisters, law school classmates, and James's sister, all women who spoke fluent lawyer, had trust funds, and measured their worth in billable hours. I was included out of obligation, not affection. At dress fittings, they discussed their careers while I stood silent, knowing my part-time work at a veterinary clinic wouldn't impress anyone. Even the wedding itself reflected our family's values. The guest list read like a who's who of Virginia's legal and medical elite. Caroline had insisted on an outdoor ceremony at an exclusive country club, complete with string quartet and 5-course dinner. Everything was designed to project success, status, and sophistication. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, I was drowning. The transition from being essential, from saving lives and making split-second decisions that mattered, to being invisible, was devastating. In Afghanistan, I knew exactly who I was and why I mattered. Back home, I felt like a stranger in my own family, watching their perfect world from the outside. What my family didn't understand was that I hadn't failed at their version of success. I had chosen a different definition entirely. While they were building careers, I had been building character. While they were earning money, I had been earning the respect of people whose lives depended on my skills. But in their world, none of that counted. In their world, I was just the daughter who couldn't measure up. The first sign that something was seriously wrong happened at Caroline's engagement party. It was a lavish affair at the Potomac Country Club, complete with champagne fountains and a jazz quartet. I stood in the corner wearing a dress I'd borrowed from a coworker, watching Caroline float around in a designer gown that cost more than my monthly rent. James's best man, Trevor, was holding court near the bar, regaling guests with stories about his recent promotion at Goldman Sachs. When he spotted me, he swaggered over with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. His opening line was a masterpiece of condescension. "So Riley, Caroline mentioned you went through a military phase. That must have been tough, playing dress-up for a few years." Playing dress-up. The words hit me like a slap. I thought about Specialist Rodriguez, who died in my arms after an IED explosion. I thought about the Purple Heart citations sitting in my apartment drawer. I thought about the nights I'd held pressure on wounds while helicopters struggled to reach us through enemy fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Playing dress up. I excused myself and found refuge in the country club's bathroom, where I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me had scars on her hands from shrapnel, circles under her eyes from insomnia, and the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much. But to everyone outside that bathroom, I was just Caroline's weird sister who couldn't get her life together. That night, I went home and opened the box I kept hidden in my closet. Inside were my military awards, photos of my unit, and letters from soldiers I'd saved. One letter, from Sergeant Mike Collins, read, "Doc Martinez, you saved my life and I got to see my daughter take her first steps because of you. Thank you for being the bravest person I know." I held that letter and cried for the first time since coming home. The breaking point came 3 weeks later at Caroline's bridal shower. Her maid of honor, Brittany, had organized an elaborate afternoon at a Michelin-starred restaurant, complete with bottomless mimosas and a gift-opening ceremony that felt more like a product placement showcase. Each present was more expensive than the last. Crystal stemware, imported linens, artwork from galleries I couldn't pronounce. When it was my turn to give Caroline her gift, I handed over a small wrapped box containing a simple silver locket I'd found at an estate sale. Inside was a photo of us as children, arms around each other at the beach. The room went silent as Caroline opened it, her smile faltering when she saw what it was. "How thoughtful," she said, her voice carrying the same tone she might use to thank someone for a participation trophy. Brittany actually snickered, whispering something to the woman next to her about, quote, sentimental value. The other women quickly moved on to discussing the next gift, a $500 set of French cooking knives. But the moment that shattered something inside me happened during the speeches. Each bridesmaid stood up to share memories and offer advice. When it was my turn, I stood shakily and began talking about how proud I was of Caroline's accomplishments, how she'd always been the successful one, while I'd taken a different path. Brittany interrupted me mid-sentence. "Don't worry, Riley. Not everyone can be a lawyer. Someone has to do the simple jobs too." The room erupted in polite laughter, as if my military service was equivalent to working at a fast food restaurant. Caroline didn't defend me. She didn't correct them. She just smiled and nodded along with their amusement. Makame. That night, I called the Veterans Crisis Line for the first time. I didn't know who else to talk to. The wedding day arrived like a storm I'd been watching approach for months. I woke up in my studio apartment at 5 a.m. not because of my alarm, but because the nightmares had started early. The same recurring dream. Explosions, screaming, the weight of someone's life bleeding out in my hands. Except this time, when I looked down, it wasn't a fellow soldier. It was me. I stared at my bridesmaid dress hanging on the closet door, a pale pink monstrosity that Caroline had chosen specifically because it would complement everyone's skin tone. Everyone except me, apparently. The color washed me out completely, making me look like I was recovering from a serious illness. Which, in a way, I was. The morning preparations took place at Caroline's penthouse apartment, where professional hair and makeup artists had transformed the space into a luxury salon. Brittany and the other bridesmaids arrived in matching silk robes, carrying Starbucks cups and chattering about their weekend plans in the Hamptons. I felt like an imposter in borrowed jewelry and drugstore makeup. While the stylist worked on my hair, I listened to the other women discuss their careers, their relationships, their vacation plans to Europe. When someone asked what I was planning for the summer, I mentioned possibly taking a trip to visit my Army buddy Rodriguez's family in Texas. The conversation immediately shifted to Brittany's upcoming Mediterranean cruise. The ceremony itself was a blur of forced smiles and professional photography. I stood at the altar watching Caroline marry James, surrounded by 200 guests who represented everything my family valued: wealth, status, connections. During the vows, Caroline spoke about James being her, quote, perfect match, and building a successful life together. Success. That word again. Always success, never happiness. Never meaning, never service. But it was the reception that changed everything. The moment I'd been dreading finally arrived when Brittany grabbed the microphone for the traditional bridesmaid speeches. She started with jokes about Caroline's Type A personality and her color-coded wedding planning binders. Then she moved on to what she called sibling dynamics. "And let's not forget Caroline's little sister Riley," Brittany announced, gesturing toward me with theatrical enthusiasm. "Caroline has always been the achiever in the family, while Riley has always been more of a free spirit. Some people go to college, some people join the military for a few years, and then figure out what they want to do when they grow up." The laughter started as a ripple and became a wave. 300 guests chuckling at my expense while I stood frozen in my ill-fitting dress. My mother's smile was strained but present. My father avoided eye contact entirely. Caroline laughed along with everyone else, as if my service to our country was nothing more than an extended gap year. "Currently, Riley is between jobs," Brittany continued, "but I'm sure she'll find something eventually. Maybe something in the medical field, since she likes helping people. Though probably not brain surgery. That requires a college degree." The roar of laughter that followed felt like being hit by shrapnel all over again. I looked around the room at these people in their designer clothes, holding their expensive champagne, treating my military service like it was community college. These people who had never missed a meal, never heard gunfire, never held a dying 19-year-old while his blood soaked through their uniform. That's when I saw him. Marcus Thompson, Caroline's friend from law school, was standing near the bar in his Coast Guard dress uniform. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't laughing. He was staring at me with an expression I recognized but hadn't seen in months: respect. Our eyes met across that crowded room, and I saw something in his face that made my breath catch. Recognition. Not of who I was supposed to be, but of who I actually was. Marcus walked toward me with the measured stride of someone who understood military bearing. While Brittany's laughter still echoed around the reception hall, he stopped directly in front of me, looked me in the eyes, and executed the sharpest salute I'd seen since leaving the service. The entire room fell silent. "Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson, United States Coast Guard," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet reception. "It's an honor to meet you, Sergeant Martinez. I heard about your commendation for the Kandahar incident. That was some exceptional work under fire." The silence that followed was deafening. 300 guests who had just been laughing at my military phase suddenly realized they might have missed something important. Brittany's confident smirk faltered. Caroline's expression shifted from amusement to confusion. My parents looked like they'd just discovered I spoke a foreign language. Marcus held my gaze steadily. "I served 2 tours with the Coast Guard in the Persian Gulf. Search and rescue operations. I know courage when I see it, and I know the kind of person who runs toward danger while others run away." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant." The word sergeant hung in the air like a revelation. Not Riley, the family disappointment. Not Caroline's weird sister. Sergeant Martinez, United States Army, combat medic, lifesaver. For the first time in months, someone had seen me for who I really was. After the reception, Marcus found me outside the venue where I was finally allowing myself to breathe. The Virginia night air was cool against my skin, a relief after hours of suffocating in that room full of people who knew my name but nothing about me. "Rough crowd in there," he said, joining me on the stone steps. "They have no idea what you've been through, do they?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Marcus nodded, understanding. "I figured. I've seen that look before. Combat veterans trying to fit back into civilian life with people who think war is something they see in movies." He told me about his own struggles adjusting after his Coast Guard service, the difficulty of explaining to his law school classmates that yes, he'd actually saved lives at sea, that his military experience wasn't just something to put on a resume. He talked about the isolation of being surrounded by people who had never served, who couldn't understand what it meant to carry responsibility for someone else's life. "Your sister mentioned you were figuring things out," Marcus said. "But from what I heard tonight, it sounds like you've already figured out who you are. The question is whether you're going to let them convince you otherwise." That conversation changed something fundamental in me. For months, I'd been trying to shrink myself to fit into my family's world, apologizing for my service, downplaying my experiences. pretending that 4 years as a combat medic was somehow less valuable than Carolyn's law degree. But Marcus's respect reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I didn't need their approval to validate my worth. Over the following weeks, Marcus and I began meeting for coffee. He introduced me to other veterans in the DC area, former Navy SEALs working as consultants, ex-Air Force pilots flying commercial, Marines who'd become teachers and firefighters. People who understood that military service wasn't a detour from real life. It was preparation for it. Through these conversations, I started remembering who I was before I came home. In Afghanistan, I'd been decisive, competent, essential. I'd made life-or-death decisions without hesitation. I'd earned the respect of my unit through actions, not connections or credentials. I'd known my purpose with absolute clarity. Now I had to decide, would I keep trying to become someone my family could accept, or would I start building a life where my service mattered, where my experience was valued, where I could use my skills to make a real difference again? 3 months after Caroline's wedding, I made a decision that would change everything. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at a job rejection letter from yet another administrative position I was overqualified for, when Marcus called with an opportunity that seemed impossible. "There's a position opening at the DC Veterans Medical Center," he said. "They need someone to run their new PTSD outreach program. It's a federal position, good benefits, and they specifically want someone with combat medical experience who understands what these guys are going through." My heart raced. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to use my military experience meaningfully, to help other veterans who were struggling the way I had been. But there was one problem. It required a recommendation from a family member or close personal reference who could speak to my character and stability. I knew I had to ask my parents. Despite everything, they were still my family, and their endorsement would carry weight with the federal hiring committee. So I drove to their house in Alexandria, rehearsing my speech the entire way. I found them in the living room, my mother reading medical journals, and my father reviewing case files. The walls were covered with Caroline's achievements, her law school graduation photo, newspaper clippings about her recent courtroom victories, her wedding portrait. My military medals were nowhere to be seen. "I need to talk to you both about something important," I began, sitting across from them in the formal living room where I'd never felt comfortable. "I have an opportunity to work at the Veterans Medical Center, helping other soldiers who are struggling with PTSD and readjustment issues." My mother looked up from her journal, her expression immediately skeptical. "Riley, don't you think it's time to move on from this military phase? You served your time. Now you need to focus on building a real career." "This is a real career, Mom. It's a federal position with the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'd be helping combat veterans transition back to civilian life, using my experience as a combat medic too." "Sweetheart," my father interrupted, setting down his papers, "we're concerned about you dwelling on these traumatic experiences. Your mother and I think it might be healthier for you to find work in a completely different field. Something more stable." The word stable hung in the air like an accusation. They thought I was unstable. After everything I'd been through, everything I'd survived, they thought I was the problem. "I need you to write a recommendation letter," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The hiring committee needs character references from family members. This job could be everything for me. A chance to use my skills, to help people who understand what I've been through." My parents exchanged a look that I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. The look that said, "What are we going to do about Riley?" The look that treated me like a problem to be managed, rather than a daughter to be supported. "We can't, in good conscience, recommend you for a position dealing with traumatized veterans," my mother said finally. "You're still processing your own trauma. How can you help others when you haven't helped yourself?" The rejection hit me like a physical blow. My own parents, who had never asked about my nightmares, never inquired about my therapy, never shown interest in my service, were now claiming I was too damaged to help other veterans. "You don't think I'm qualified to do this job?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We think you're qualified for many things," my father said diplomatically. "But this particular role might be too emotionally demanding given your current state." Current state. As if my PTSD made me broken rather than experienced. As if surviving combat made me weak rather than strong. That night I called Marcus and told him what had happened. There was a long silence before he spoke. "Riley," he said, "some battles you have to fight without your family's blessing. The question is, Are you going to let their fear define your future? Or are you going to trust what you know about yourself? I decided to apply for the Veterans Medical Center position anyway. Marcus helped me find alternative references. My former commanding officer, a VA counselor I'd been working with, and Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma. Within 2 weeks, I received a call for an interview. The interview went better than I could have imagined. The panel consisted of 3 people: a Vietnam veteran who ran the medical center, a former Navy nurse, and a civilian administrator. They didn't see my PTSD as a liability. They saw it as an asset. My combat experience, my medical training, and my personal understanding of veteran struggles made me exactly what they were looking for. Sergeant Martinez, the panel chair said, we've reviewed your military record and spoken with your references. We'd like to offer you the position as Program Coordinator for Veteran Outreach Services. You'd be developing support programs for returning combat veterans dealing with PTSD and readjustment challenges. I accepted immediately. For the first time since coming home, I felt like I had a purpose again. A mission. A chance to use everything I'd learned, everything I'd survived, to help others who were fighting the same battles. But when I called my parents to share the news, their reaction was swift and devastating. "Riley, we need to talk," my mother said, her voice carrying that clinical tone she used with difficult patients. "Can you come over tonight? Caroline will be here too." I arrived at their house to find what felt like an intervention. My parents sat on one side of the living room, Caroline on the other, all wearing expressions of concerned disappointment. A manila folder sat on the coffee table between us. "We've been doing some research about this job you've taken," my father began, adjusting his glasses. "And we're concerned about the implications." Caroline leaned forward, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "Riley, taking a position that specifically deals with traumatized veterans is going to follow you for the rest of your career. Future employers will see that and assume you have serious psychological issues." What Caroline is trying to say, my mother added, is that this job essentially labels you as damaged goods. It's career suicide for someone with your background. My background. They made my military service sound like a criminal record. "We've spoken to some people," Caroline continued, opening the manila folder to reveal several job listings, corporate positions, administrative roles, even some medical office jobs that would value your organizational skills. Real career opportunities that won't pigeonhole you as the PTSD veteran. I stared at them in disbelief. "You think helping other veterans is pigeonholing myself?" "We think," my father said carefully, "that constantly surrounding yourself with reminders of trauma isn't healthy. You need to move forward, not backward." The conversation escalated quickly. They argued that taking this job would prevent me from ever being seen as anything other than a veteran with problems. They worried about what their friends would think, what it would say about our family's success rate. They wanted me to decline the position and take one of their more appropriate alternatives. "You're embarrassed by my service," I said finally, the words cutting through their diplomatic language. "We're proud of your service," my mother replied, "but service is supposed to prepare you for civilian success, not trap you in the military mindset forever." When I refused to quit the job, they played their final card. Caroline stood up, her expression shifting from concern to something colder. "If you insist on taking this position," she said, "we can't support you financially anymore. No more family dinners where you might upset our guests with war stories. No more introducing you at social events where you might embarrass us. You'll be on your own." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a burned bridge. Choose the job that gave my life meaning, or choose the family that wanted me to be someone else entirely. I looked around that perfect living room one last time, at the photos of Caroline's achievements, at the parents who had never understood what I'd sacrificed for my country. "Then I guess I'm on my own," I said, and walked out. 3 days after walking out of my parents' house, the real battle began. I arrived at my new job at the Veterans Medical Center to find an email from the Human Resources Department requesting an urgent meeting to discuss concerns that have been brought to our attention. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what this was about. Dr. Helen Morrison, the HR director, sat across from me with a manila folder that looked disturbingly familiar. She opened it to reveal printed emails, phone records, and what appeared to be a formal complaint. "Ms. Martinez," she began, We've received some concerning information about your mental health status from what appear to be family members. There are allegations that you've been struggling with severe PTSD symptoms, that you've been unstable, and that your family has serious concerns about your ability to handle the responsibilities of this position. I stared at the documents, recognizing my mother's clinical language and Carolyn's legal precision. They had contacted my workplace directly, attempting to sabotage the one opportunity I'd found to rebuild my life with purpose. These are serious allegations, Dr. Morrison continued. We're going to need you to undergo a full psychological evaluation before you can begin working with veterans. We can't risk placing someone who might be mentally unstable in a position where they're counseling traumatized soldiers. The irony was suffocating. My family was using my PTSD, the very experience that qualified me to help other veterans, as a weapon to destroy my career. They were turning my wounds into disqualifications, my survival into instability. But I wasn't the same broken woman who had stood silent at Caroline's wedding while people laughed at my service. Marcus and my veteran friends had helped me remember something crucial. I was a combat medic who had saved lives under impossible conditions. I didn't need to defend my worthiness. I needed to prove it. Dr. Morrison, I said, pulling out my phone, before we proceed with any evaluation, I'd like you to listen to something. I played a recording that Marcus had helped me prepare. It was Sergeant Mike Collins, the soldier whose life I'd saved in Kandahar, explaining in detail what had happened during the mortar attack. His voice was steady, professional, grateful. Doc Martinez performed emergency surgery in the back of a moving vehicle while we were taking incoming fire. His voice filled the office. She saved my life and 2 others that day. She's the most competent medic I ever served with. Any veteran would be lucky to have her in their corner. Dr. Morrison's expression shifted as she listened. I followed with a recording from Captain Williams, my former commanding officer, describing my service record, my commendations, my reputation among the troops as someone who could be trusted with lives. The family members who contacted you, I said after the recordings ended, have never served in the military. They've never worked with veterans. They think PTSD makes someone weak, but in this field, it makes someone qualified. I know what these veterans are going through because I've been there myself. Dr. Morrison closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. Ms. Martinez, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Personal vendettas have no place in our hiring decisions. Your military record speaks for itself. The psychological evaluation they insisted on became my vindication. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a former Army psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma, spent 3 hours interviewing me. Her report was clear. While I had PTSD, I was managing it effectively through therapy and had turned my experience into a strength rather than a liability. Ms. Martinez demonstrates exceptional insight into trauma recovery, her report stated. Her personal experience with combat stress, combined with her medical training and proven ability to function under extreme pressure, makes her uniquely qualified for this position. But my family wasn't finished. Over the next month, they escalated their campaign. Caroline used her legal connections to request my military records, looking for any documentation of mental health issues they could use against me. My mother contacted the VA hospital's board of directors, claiming I was using my position to avoid dealing with my own trauma. Each attack only strengthened my resolve. With Marcus's help, I documented every attempt at sabotage, every manipulative phone call, every effort to undermine my career. I was no longer fighting just for a job. I was fighting for the right to define my own worth, to use my experience to help others, to prove that surviving trauma makes you stronger, not weaker. 6 months into my job at the Veterans Medical Center, something remarkable happened. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. The work gave me purpose in a way nothing had since leaving the military. Every day I helped veterans who understood exactly what I'd been through, and they helped me understand that my experiences weren't shameful secrets to hide, but valuable tools for healing. My first major success came with a Marine named Danny Rodriguez, who'd been struggling with severe PTSD after 3 deployments in Iraq. He'd been through multiple therapists and was considering ending his life when he was referred to our program. During our first session, he looked at the scars on my hands and asked bluntly, "Were you deployed?" When I told him about Afghanistan, about the mortar attacks and the soldiers I'd lost, something shifted in his expression. Finally, he said, someone who actually gets it. Over the following months, Danny and I worked together on coping strategies, job placement, and rebuilding his relationship with his family. The transformation was incredible. He went from being suicidal to becoming one of our program's peer counselors, helping other veterans who were walking the same dark path he'd escaped. Stories like Danny's multiplied. Veterans who had been written off by traditional therapy programs flourished under our approach. We understood that their trauma wasn't a weakness to overcome, but an experience to process and integrate. We spoke the same language, shared the same nightmares, carried the same invisible wounds. The program's success caught national attention. Within a year, we'd reduced veteran suicide attempts in our district by 40%. The VA headquarters in Washington took notice, and I was invited to present our methods at a national conference on veteran mental health. Standing on that stage in front of 500 mental health professionals, I thought about Caroline's wedding reception, about Brittany's mocking laughter, about my parents' insistence that my military service was something to move past rather than build upon. Here I was, being celebrated for the very experiences they had wanted me to hide. The most effective treatment for combat trauma, I told the audience, comes from practitioners who understand it personally. We can't heal what we haven't acknowledged, and we can't guide someone through darkness we've never navigated ourselves. The applause that followed felt different from any recognition I'd received in my family's world. This wasn't polite acknowledgement of achievement. This was respect for wisdom earned through suffering and transformed into service. But the real transformation was personal. Working with other veterans helped me see my own journey clearly. I wasn't broken. I was experienced. I wasn't damaged. I was seasoned. The very traits my family saw as problems, my hypervigilance, my intensity, my inability to engage in small talk about trivial matters, were exactly what made me effective in my work. Marcus had become more than a friend and mentor. Our relationship grew from mutual understanding into something deeper. He proposed on the anniversary of Caroline's wedding, in the same venue where he'd first saluted me. This time, the room was filled with veterans and their families, people who understood that strength comes in many forms. I fell in love with your courage first, he said as he knelt with the ring, but I fell deeper when I saw your compassion. We were married 6 months later, in a simple ceremony at the Veterans Medical Center Chapel. Instead of designer gowns and country club elegance, we had dress uniforms and genuine celebration. Instead of guests who measured success by bank accounts and job titles, we had people who measured it by lives saved and service rendered. Spiel. My parents didn't attend. Caroline sent a card with a generic message about wishing us happiness. But the chapel was full of the family I'd chosen. Veterans who'd become brothers and sisters, colleagues who'd become lifelong friends, and patients who'd become success stories. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who saw my military service not as a phase to outgrow, but as a foundation to build upon. 5 years after that wedding reception where I was laughed at for being between jobs, I stood in the Rose Garden at the White House, receiving the Presidential Citizens Medal for my work with veteran suicide prevention. The irony wasn't lost on me that the president himself was thanking me for the very work my family had tried to sabotage. Sergeant Riley Martinez, the president said as he placed the medal around my neck, has saved more lives as a civilian than most people save in their entire military careers. Her innovative veteran outreach programs have been implemented in VA hospitals nationwide, reducing veteran suicide rates by an unprecedented margin. In the audience, I spotted Marcus in his dress uniform, tears streaming down his face. Beside him sat Danny Rodriguez, now the director of peer counseling at 3 different VA centers. Behind them were dozens of veterans whose lives had been transformed by our programs, men and women who had found hope when they thought none existed. My parents weren't there. Caroline wasn't there. But the family I'd chosen, the family that understood my worth, filled every seat that mattered. After the ceremony, I was approached by Congressman Bradley, chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Ms. Martinez, he said, we'd like to discuss the possibility of you testifying before Congress about the need for increased veteran mental health funding. Your work has been revolutionary. Revolutionary. The word echoed in my mind as I thought about Brittany's mocking laughter, about my mother's insistence that helping veterans was, quote, career suicide, about Caroline's prediction that my choices would make me unemployable. That evening, at the reception following the ceremony, I received an unexpected text message. It was from Caroline. Saw the news coverage. Congratulations on your achievement. Perhaps we could have lunch sometime soon. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Thank you for the congratulations. I'm quite busy with my career these days. The truth was, I had moved far beyond needing their validation. The little girl who once desperately wanted her family's approval had grown into a woman who created her own definition of success. I measured my worth not in status symbols or social connections, but in lives saved, futures restored, and hope rekindled. My work had expanded beyond individual therapy. Marcus and I co-founded the Bridge Home Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided comprehensive transition services for combat veterans. We offered job training, mental health support, housing assistance, and most importantly, community. We created the family structure for veterans that many of us had never had in civilian life. The foundation's success attracted national attention. Within 3 years, we had chapters in 15 states. Major corporations began partnering with us, recognizing that hiring veterans wasn't charity, it was smart business. These men and women brought leadership skills, crisis management experience, and a work ethic that couldn't be taught in business school. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychiatrist who had supported me during my early struggles with PTSD, nominated me for the American Psychological Association's Award for Distinguished Contributions to Practice. In her nomination letter, she wrote, Ms. Martinez has transformed the field of veteran mental health by proving that the wounded healer is often the most effective healer. The wounded healer. That phrase captured something profound about my journey. My scars weren't badges of shame. They were credentials of understanding. My trauma wasn't a disqualification. It was a specialization. My struggle wasn't a weakness. It was my greatest strength. Today, when I speak at conferences and universities, I always begin with the same story. The night at my sister's wedding when a Coast Guard officer's salute reminded me of who I really was. I tell audiences that sometimes the people who know you longest understand you least, and sometimes a stranger's respect can save your life. The young veterans in my programs often ask me the same question Danny Rodriguez asked years ago. How do you know I can get through this? And I give them the same answer every time. Because I did. Because others did. Because you're stronger than you know, and you're not alone in this fight. My family taught me that success meant conforming to their expectations. The military taught me that success meant serving something greater than yourself. But my work with veterans taught me the most important lesson of all. Success means using your hardest experiences to prevent others from facing the same struggles alone. That wedding reception where I felt so small, so dismissed, so invisible, it was actually the beginning of everything. Because that was the night I met someone who saw my worth, when I couldn't see it myself. That was the night I learned that respect isn't something you inherit from your family name. It's something you earn through your actions, your service, and your willingness to stand up for others who can't yet stand up for themselves. Sometimes the moment when you feel most defeated is actually the moment when your real life begins. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.